Uh, so I'm going to talk today about basics of plant anatomy and structure, and along with that, the idea of the importance of recognizing plants and being able to look at plants. I'm going to talk about how to look at plants and how to see plants. Um, I think that one thing that a lot of people notice when they start learning about herbal medicine or when they start learning about botany in general is that a lot of us tend to have gone through a big chunk of our lives just sort of ignoring the plants around us, or just sort of visually blending them into massive greenness without really looking at them as individual things. In contrast to the way that we look at animals. I think when most of us are really little, we learn to tell the difference between dogs and cats. We learn to recognize horses and cows, things like that. And, generally speaking, even as small children, we can recognize them without knowing technical details. When you're trying to tell if something's a horse or a cow, you probably don't have to open its mouth and see whether it has top teeth, or look closely at its hooves and see if it has cloven hooves or one big hoof. You can tell from your car as you're driving down the road that something is a horse or a cow if your eyesight's good and it's not too far away. So that's how we look at animals. And for whatever reason, most of us are not really taught to look at plants in the same way. I think that there's the expectation that we won't directly interact with plants if we're not growing up on a farm or something like that. Now, if you grew up in the woods, this is probably not your experience at all. If you grew up on a farm or out in the woods, you probably could learn to tell the difference between different kinds of trees and different kinds of plants and things like that. But for a lot of us, this is what we experience. And it's very limiting because it's really good to know what kind of plants are around you. It really gives you a lot of information about your environment. And as such, it's a really good skill to have. So when we're learning to recognize plants, often the first thing that we look at is the flower. We learn flowers are much more, for whatever reason, tend to be more recognizable to people than other parts of plants. If I tell you to picture a sunflower, you can probably imagine what the flower of a sunflower looks like. If I tell you, think about the leaf of a sunflower, would you recognize the leaf of a sunflower? Maybe and maybe not. If I showed you the root of a sunflower, you would almost definitely not recognize it. I'm not sure I would either, because we don't really see those. But flowers are the showiest part, and therefore the part that people usually have the strongest visual impression of plants. And so often we use flowers and the shape and color of flowers to distinguish plants from one another. We also use the arrangements of flowers, the shapes and arrangements of the leaves, and the general size and type of the plant. In other words, we have this concept that we call habit, which sounds like, when you're talking about a person, a habit is something they do. When you're talking about a plant, it's sort of the shape that it grows in, whether it's a tree or a vine or an herbaceous plant, which is sometimes called a forb, or whether it's a grass or whatever. So those types of things can be things that we can learn to recognize too. In recent years, a lot of people use apps to help them recognize plants. Before the apps were popular, there were two other types of tools called a field guide, which would be something that had illustrations, often photographs, as well as descriptions of the plants. And then something else called a flora, or a key, which would have all the plants in your area listed, and you could differentiate them based on a series of yes and no questions. Like, for example, does it have a hairy stem? And if it doesn't have a hairy stem, then you turn to this page. And if it does have a hairy stem, you continue reading. And then there will be another question, and you'll either continue reading or go on to a different page, depending on what the answer to the question is. So that's called a flora or a dichotomous key. And so those are older tools for recognizing plants. There are also the apps, like I said, some of which are pretty good. iNaturalist is one that I've heard recommended a lot. Google Lens is another one that a lot of people seem to use. And those can be useful. They're not always right. And similarly, using a key or using a field guide isn't always going to give you the right answer either. But they can be helpful. It's really good to have someone else that you can ask, is this what this is? And it's also good as you go along to develop the skill of just being able to visually recognize things, the same way that you would recognize dogs and horses, the same way that you would recognize other individual people that you know. And because what that does is it allows you to look at a plant community and, without a whole lot of work on your part, make some observations and analysis about that plant community. So for instance, if you go to an area and you see a certain set of plants growing, it might be able to tell you about the age and health of the forest, or the type of soil that's in the field that you're in, or something like that. And that's much easier to do if you can just look at the plants and recognize them than if you have to look up each individual plant and list them and then start making inferences based on that. So it's a good thing to be able to recognize things, and it allows you to sort of make some inferences and draw some information on your own. And so hopefully over the course of the next year, you'll get to that point, if you're not there already, of being able to look around you and really take in a scene and recognize many of the plants that are in it altogether, and even learn some things about what the land is telling you through the presence of these plants, what they indicate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some plant anatomy basics. Plant anatomy helps us understand how plants work, which I've been talking about some these past couple weeks. And it also helps us to be able to recognize plants and learn the terms for the names of the different parts of plants and things like that. So you kind of have a better idea of what you're looking at. What we're going to look at right now is mostly about flowering plants. So it doesn't apply to everything that we use in the world of herbal medicine. For instance, there are ferns, which have leaves and stems and roots, but they don't have flowers and they don't have seeds in the conventional sense. There are also mushrooms, funguses, which are kind of a completely different thing anatomically. They don't have leaves or roots. Sometimes they have something like a stem, but it's a pretty different structure than the stem of a plant, both in terms of what it's made of and what it's used for. So, you know, we give the same name to it, but it's really a different sort of thing. So, you know, what I'm saying mostly applies to flowering plants, not even so much to grasses and pine trees, although to some extent to those as well. But it will apply to a lot of the plants that you will want to know about in terms of herbal medicine, and in terms of the plants that we'll talk about in the course of this class's Materia Medica sections, the weekly descriptions of plants that we have. So let me just find the first one of these that I want to look at with you. Do a little share content thing. So this is some basics of plant anatomy. And if you look over at the sunflower on the left, you'll see a couple of different sections. There is the leaf, the stem, and the root. And then, of course, at the top, there's the flower. Sunflowers aren't the greatest example for getting into flower anatomy because they have a more complex flower anatomy that disc being made up of hundreds and hundreds of little tiny flowers, and each of those yellow things also being a separate flower in its own right. But the leaf, stem, and root are fairly similar to what they are on other flowering plants. And so we'll talk a little bit about those. There is a convention of describing everything underground as being the root system. This might include underground parts of the stem. It might include roots, root hairs, and other structures associated with the roots, tubers, rhizomes, things like that. And then the shoot, or the aerial parts, is the more usual term to use in the herbal medicine world, which just means everything that's above the ground. So that's kind of a distinction that's just based on there being a ground, which not all plants even grow in ground, but often they do. But yeah, the shoot, or as we usually say in herbal medicine, the aerial parts of the plant, and then the root system of the plant, which includes roots and other associated underground structure. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side of the image, there's some kind of microscopic cross sections of these different parts of the plant. So on the top one, I'm just going to kind of go over each of these sections a little bit. There's the cuticle, which is just sort of a thin covering over the leaf. It's mainly there to help it retain moisture. This isn't evident in all leaves. It's especially noticeable in succulents because it's, like I said, there to help retain moisture, and a lot of succulents are kind of deserty type plants. Under that, you have the epidermis, which is just the skin of the plant, essentially. The epidermis has holes in it that are called stoma, that are for breathing and for exchange of fluids and gases with the outside air. And then under the epidermis, you have the mesophyllum, which here they've got spongy mesophyll cells and palisade mesophyll cells, which are two different types. But mesophyll just means kind of the middle of the plant, the middle, the inner part of the leaf. And included in that, you have the leaf veins, which are vascular tissue, which would be the xylem and phloem you see below that. Xylem is harder tissue that gives structure to the veins and ribs of plants, and phloem is kind of more pithy and allows for fluid to pass through it. And then you have the underside of the leaf, which has more of the stoma than the upper side of the leaf. So the stoma are basically pores. And if you ever look at a leaf, you'll notice, say, if you think about a maple leaf, for instance, or most tree leaves, they'll be sort of paler on the underside and darker on the upper side. It's because they have more of the shiny cuticle on the upper side that's exposed to the sun, and they tend to have more stoma that allow for breathing on the underside. So inside these cells are chloroplasts, which catch sunlight and use it to run metabolism, use it to make food. And they are also the organs of respiration for the plant. So it's breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen and water vapor, especially from the leaf all the time. And then if you look at the next cross section down, this is just a thin slice of the stem. It's not at the same scale of magnification as the one from the leaf. It's a much lower level of magnification, but you can see we have the xylem and the phloem also, which are the types of vascular tissue. Then you have the cortex. Cortex is just like the bark, or the inner bark, and then you have the epidermis, which is the outside of it. This is on an herbaceous stem. On a woody stem, you might have a thicker bark on the outside. But the main purpose of the stem, well, it has a couple of purposes. The stem helps to conduct fluid up from the ground to the leaves of the plant, or sometimes from the water that it's growing out of to the leaves of the plant. So it has lots of little thin channels that the water can pass through. And then it is also structural. It helps to hold the flower and the leaves up so that they can be up in the sunlight where they're going to get sunlight, where the flower is going to get its scent or its pollen spread on the air. In the case of things with scent, it's usually attracting insects that pollinate it. In the case of spreading the pollen, it doesn't need to attract them. The pollen itself blows on the wind. So having it up in the air helps with that. It also helps hold it up above other plants, because plants are sort of vying for positions in the sunlight when you have a field of plants. So maybe you'll have a field of grass, and then you'll have some taller plants growing up through the grass trying to get the sunlight, because if they were down on the ground, they'd be more shaded out by the grass. Plants have lots of different adaptations for catching sunlight, because that's their main job. Just like predatory animals have to catch other animals, and herbaceous animals have to find forage, plants have to find sunlight. They have to catch sunlight. So that's a lot of what they're doing. And the stem helps with that. And stems actually move. They can move with the sun. They can move based on gravity, and they can move based on the presence of water. So all of these are ways that plants help to position themselves to best take advantage of the resources in their immediate environment. Now, if you look at the next section, the next little cross section on the right-hand side here, you've still got the phloem and xylem, and then you've got the cortex, which is different in the root than it is on the other in the stem. Roots don't usually contain much chlorophyll at all, because they're not exposed to much sunlight, so they don't really get a chance to make the sunlight into energy. But they often have structures in their cells called vacuoles, which are there for storing starches, storing carbohydrates. And there are often a lot of other substances that are stored in the root. So the root is an area of storage for both the calories that the plant has saved up from the sun, as well as sometimes secondary phytochemicals, medicinal substances, things like that. These plants also have root hairs, which are mainly there to draw in nutrients from the environment, whereas the whole root itself might be partly is there to draw up water and act as vascular tissue, conducting fluid to the upper parts of the plant, but also it's holding the plant in place, and it's holding the soil in place around the plant. Roots also have a lot to do with what sorts of organisms are growing in the soil. And sometimes those organisms in the soil have a lot to do with the nutrients that the plants are able to get from the soil. So in some plants, for instance, there might be substances in the root like sugars that help to attract ants. And then the ants aerate the soil around the plant. And then when they die, the nitrogen from their bodies acts as fertilizer for the plant. So, there's a complex ecological interaction between roots and the soil that they're growing in a lot of cases. There can also be fungi that grow on roots. There can be other plants that grow on roots, and various other parts of plants as well. So this is a very, very simplified version of the story, but these are kind of the basic overall structure of a plant. And like I said, with different plants, the leaves would be different shapes, the flowers would be different shapes, the roots might be different shapes too, but this structure holds throughout the flowering plant part of the plant world. So it's a very common setup. And even in other types of plants, there might be analogous structures that are not quite the same, but similar in some ways. So when you are trying to identify a plant, if you found a plant, you'll want to notice what color the flower is, how the petals of the flower are arranged, and what shape the leaves are and how the leaves are arranged. So for many, many plants, just having those pieces of information, flower shape and color and arrangement, and leaf shape and color and arrangement, will tell you what kind of plant you're looking at. I'll give you an example of something that is two things that are very common and similar that are blooming right now. One of them is dandelion, and one of them is sow thistle. Dandelion, you're probably all at least somewhat familiar with. They have these flowers that look kind of like fuzzy golden discs. Sow thistles have a very similar but slightly smaller flower. Dandelions have a deeply lobed leaf that is sort of jagged, and that leaf grows in what's called a basal rosette. So it's on the ground at the base of the plant, growing out in all different directions of the compass. So that's why it's called a rosette, because it's kind of like a rose or like a compass rose. It's growing out in all different directions in a circle. So sow thistle has the similar shape of leaves, and it has very similar shape and color of flowers. But instead of the leaves just growing right at the base of the plant, it has a stem with leaves growing off of the stem in different directions. And these leaves are prickly, unlike a dandelion's leaf. And so that arrangement of the leaf and that detail about the leaf is how you differentiate them from a dandelion. Rather than being a plant that grows right at ground level, it's a plant that grows up on a stem that's maybe a foot tall, maybe 3 feet tall. And at the top of that stem, which has leaves all up it and branches, then you have the little flowers. And instead of just one at the top of one stem, you have a few of them growing at the top of the plant. So that is that's the difference between dandelion and sow thistle. And they are they're both very common plants in my environment and in a lot of other places as well. They're very widespread, and they have the same yellow flower and the same blow ball, except it's quite a bit smaller on the sow thistle. I'm going to actually step outside and see if we can see either of them right now. Okay, so this isn't either of them. This is wild lettuce, but it has a similar leaf shape, and it also has a very similar flower. But it has a single line of prickles up the middle of the leaf, and you can see how the leaves have sort of arranged themselves side to side, like they're flattened side to side. So that's a little different than it would be in dandelion or sow thistle. And that's how I recognize it, actually, when I look at it, is that the leaves are just arranged differently on the stem, even though the basic leaf shape is the same. And if there were a flower, it would be similar too. Just want to walk along over here and see if I see either of the other plants I was talking about, though. They're weedy species, so they like to grow along fences and things like that. There's the dandelion. In this case, you can see it's just growing right at the base is where the leaves are. Here's a better example. It's growing out in different directions from a central point. But when the stem comes up, the stem doesn't have any leaves on it. The stem just has a smooth stem with a flower at the top, growing right out of the middle of this basal rosette. So that's how we recognize dandelion, as opposed to the other two plants, is that it just grows directly on that simple unbranching stem. You don't really see a dandelion with a branching stem. You might see multiple simple stems coming up out of the same spot, but not stems that branch. All right, so I don't see sow thistle, but the wild lettuce is similar in principle anyway. Remember how I was talking about how a lot of plants are what we call rooterals, and they grow in this kind of environment, a disturbed ground area. And that rudera is from the Latin word for rubble. So got plenty of that over there. Let's see. So as I'm going to walk back in here, I'm going to go ahead and share another diagram. So these are the parts of a flower. And this is a really important thing to learn to be able to recognize plants, how a flower is set up. And I think of flowers as consisting of multiple concentric circles. It's kind of an idealized way to look at it, or a sort of geographical way to look at it. I mean, geometric way to look at it. When in real life, it's messier and more irregular than that. But you can't see it as easily in this because it's like a split in half type of flower. But you'll notice that down below the flower, you've got the sepal. The sepals are a series of little leaves that grow around the base of the flower. They sort of enclose it before it opens up, and then the petals come out. So if you were imagining a bud opening, the thing that was on the outside at the beginning is like the sepal, and then the flower buds open, and the petals open. And so the petals are another concentric circle. You have a ring of sepals, and then a ring of petals, and then you have a ring of stamens. The stamens are these little skinny things with a yellow thing on top. The skinny thing is called a filament, and the yellow thing is called an anther. That anther is the male part of the plant. So it's related to the anthros meaning human, or andros meaning male, same kind of Greek root, but the anther is the male part of the plant. And then in the center of the ring of anthers is the singular pistil. The pistil is the female part of the plant that develops into the seeds. So the anther holds the pollen. The pollen gets distributed however it gets distributed, whether by wind or self-pollination or insects, or in some cases, slugs or snails or mice or bats. There are many different vectors for pollen, but the pollen finds its way from the anther to the stigma, usually from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant, although some plants are self-fertile. So the stigma is the place where the anther, where the pollen attaches. Usually it's kind of wet. It's got some fluid on it that helps to catch the pollen and conduct it down to the ovary, which develops into the fruit. So you've got the pollen grain gets stuck in the stigma, goes down through the pollen tubes, and then eventually makes its way to the to the gamete, and that develops into a seed surrounded by a fruit. Sometimes you'll have the word ovum for the fruit and ovary for the seed. And then that in turn contains a whole new plant that's it's got all the plant DNA from both the parental gametes, and then it's got all the parts, all the makings of a new plant kind of wrapped up inside the seed, and through a plant embryo that hatches out and grows into a new plant. So when you're learning to recognize plants, sometimes you look at not only the color of the petals, but also how many petals there are, how the petals are arranged. So for instance, the mustard family, Brassicaceae, they generally speaking have 4 petals that are at right angles to each other. So the family used to be called crucifery, meaning cross bearers, because they all have that cross-shaped arrangement of the flower petals. And if you look at roses, they tend to have, in the wild varieties, 5 petals arranged kind of in the shape of a 5-pointed star. And that's something that's fairly distinctive about things in the rose family, whether it's roses themselves or apples or various other fruits that are members of that family, blackberries, raspberries, and so forth. Hang on just a second. Let me show you another why am I this? Okay. Let me show you. Sorry, I'm trying to share another piece of content, and that thing is not popping up for me. Oh, there we go. Yeah, well, I can't get to it right now. So yeah, so basically different types of roses. There are a lot of different kinds, but they pretty much tend to have some 5-pointed, 5-petaled arrangement of their petals on their flower. I want to show you on this poster that I have here some of the different shapes of flowers here. So, oh my God, hang on a second. All right, so just as for instance, here's a poppy. It's a very simple type of flower. The poppy has it has just petals, regular petals. They're not composite flowers. A lot of the ones that are in this poster are composite flowers, which are a little bit different. But that's the poppy, and you can see that it has those petals. And then for this one, this is digitalis. So it has what's called a corollary tube. So you can see at the base of the tube, you have the sepals here, but the petals are actually fused into one long tube instead of being separate. And then you would have the reproductive parts up in here so that only certain types of insect can climb in there and get to the nectar and get to the parts that make it able to reproduce. And then this is buttercup here, ranunculus. And you can see the back of it. You have the circle of the sepals, and then you have the circle of the petals. And then here you have the circle of the anthers, and then the female part would be in the center of that. So there are a whole bunch of plants in the buttercup family, and they're all set up just like that. Some of them have fewer petals. They don't have a consistent number of petals for the whole group, but they are all set up in the same way, and most of them have yellow flowers just like that. So lots of different types of variations on the same theme, but consistently there. And then in this case, you might have this is Ecopodium. It's in the carrot family, celery family, but you can see there's the same a bunch of little flowers arranged on stems. This is called an umbel, but each of the little flowers follows the same general setup of having the sepals and the petals, and then the reproductive parts, male outside and then female innermost in the inside the plant. So lots of different variations on the same theme, but it holds true in general for flowering plants. By contrast, let me show you ferns. Ferns have fronds, which are basically their leaves. They have root systems, and then they have fronds. This is called a polypody, and instead of having separate little fronds, these are all fused together. And they actually reproduce by these structures called spores that grow on the underside of the fronds and fall off. And each of those contains the genetic material and the physical material to make a new set of ferns. Some of them, like this walking fern, also reproduce vegetatively. So the leaf will grow along the skinny frond, and then the tip will go into the moss or whatever it's growing in and put down a new set of roots. So a lot of the time, plants will have undifferentiated cells that can turn into roots or leaves or whatever it needs them to turn into. And in the case of ferns, in the case of this kind of fern, they call these walking ferns. That's at the end there, and it will grow a new fern where it roots into the ground. We don't use a whole lot of ferns in herbal medicine, but there are ferns that are used medicinally. And hang on a second. No. Okay, there are ferns that are used medicinally. Mostly the roots are used. Yeah, so learning that part of plant anatomy is really helpful to learning to recognize plants, because it will help you to recognize the patterns in different families of plants, and it will help you to learn what you need to know to be able to recognize different species of plants. So we categorize plants into families based on large groups of plants that have some similar patterns to how they grow. And then we subdivide those families into genera. Genera is the plural, genus is the singular. So a genus of plants is a group of closely related species, and a species is one specific type of plant. Sometimes exactly what makes a species is a little bit nebulous, is a little bit variable, or not necessarily super well defined. Sometimes people who study plants will disagree on whether two different types of plants are just varieties or whether they're truly separate species. But generally speaking, species can freely reproduce with each other and have very consistent characteristics and are more closely related to other members of their same species than they are related to anything outside of their species. Similarly, in a genus, everything within that genus should be more closely related to one another than they are to any plant outside of that genus. So sometimes people view this as being like branches of a family tree or branches and sub-branches of a family tree. Nowadays, scientists really look at the genetics of plants, but up until about 25 years ago or so, they were really mostly just looking at the shape of the plants and the structure of the plants. So most of the existing categories, they've been redefined some and renamed some, but a lot of the existing categories were dreamt up by people a couple hundred years ago or from a couple hundred years ago moving forward, and were based on observable similarities and differences between plants. So as we move along, we'll talk about some of the big plant families and what the patterns of those plant families are and things like that. But for the moment, I just want you to have enough of a grasp of botany that when we go out and look at plants this weekend, if you're coming to do that, or when you go out and look at plants on your own, to make your plant collections and things like that, that you'll have some background for being able to recognize things for, if the guidebook tells you how many sepals the plant is supposed to have, you'll know where to look for them. Things like that. There are many different leaf shapes. Sometimes things will describe shapes of different leaves. I don't have a diagram for that right now, but two main categories are simple leaves and compound leaves. Simple leaf, you just have the leaf stem, the petiole, and one leaf on it. An oak leaf or a maple leaf would be a good example of that, a simple leaf. An oak leaf is divided, it's lobed into sections, but it's not made up of a bunch of smaller leaves. By contrast, there are some leaves like the leaf of a vetch plant, for instance, or the leaf of a pecan tree would be made up of a bunch of smaller leaflets that are all attached to a central stem. And that whole thing falls off in the fall if it's a deciduous plant and grows back as a unit, but it looks like a bunch of leaves, but it's really just one leaf made out of a bunch of smaller leaflets. Walnuts are another example of that. We'll, if you come on the plant walk this weekend, you'll get to, I will point this out to you and show you in real life what I mean and exactly what it looks like and exactly how you can recognize the difference between leaves and leaflets, or simple leaves and compound leaves with leaflets. We see a lot of compound leaves on trees. Sometimes we see them on herbaceous plants as well. So those are good things to familiarize yourself with and be able to recognize. Also, I talked a little bit about ferns. I didn't really talk about conifers. Conifers don't have flowers, they have cones. Most of them have separate male and female cones. The male cones produce pollen and the female cones produce seeds, just like in the case of flowers. With plants, most plants have male and female parts. In other words, pollen producing parts and seed producing parts in the same flower and on the same plant. But that's not always true. Some plants have separate plants where one plant will have the male parts and one plant will have the female parts. And in some plants like oak trees, they sort of switch back and forth between which set of flowers they're making that year. So with a given oak tree, some years it will make pollen and some years it will make acorns. So, it has the DNA for both all the time. And it doesn't necessarily switch one year and then one year the other way. Sometimes it will do the same thing for multiple years. Sometimes it will switch back and forth. And, I don't know that people have lots of different ideas about why that happens, but I don't know that that's like really been definitively answered. But it makes a lot of difference if you're going to be out in the woods to what kind of wildlife you're likely to see, whether the oak trees around you have acorns on them this year or not, because acorns are an enormous food source for the forest. And so deers and squirrels and the hawks that eat squirrels and things like that are all going to vary in their how much of them you're going to see in a given area based on whether the acorns are on or off that year, that fall, or the next spring. So it can make a big difference to that sort of thing, which in turn can make a difference to lots of other aspects of the ecology of an area. And so that's another piece of awareness for you. It's not just oak trees that do that, but they're a well-known example. And hold on a second. Just a question of, if you can't make the walk, where can you view it? It is going to be, I'm going to live stream it to my one of my YouTube channels. I will send everybody the link for where that's going to be. It's not the same channel that these videos go to. It's the one under the username Clinical Herbalist, but it will be live streamed and it will be recorded. So hopefully, if you are not able to be there, you can have the choice of either watching it from somewhere else, if you have the connection to do so, or watching it later on. The thing about watching an herb walk later on is that there's a lot of just walking around. There's a lot of just walking from one place to the next, getting from one plant to the next. So, you can skip through chunks of it without missing a whole lot some of the time. But if you can make it, I strongly recommend it, because it will be a good hands-on experience, good chance to see some plants in real life and work with, get to feel them, touch them, have that experiential real world connection to them. All right, so generally speaking, just in quick review of the basics of plant anatomy, you've got the aerial parts of the plant, which include the flower, the leaf, and the stem. Also the bud, which is the same thing as the flower, but before it turns into a flower, and the fruit, which is the same thing as the flower, but after it's been a flower. So that's all, the same structure at different phases. So all of that is the above ground part of the plant, with very few exceptions. And then the underground part of the plant is the root system, which may include roots, rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, corms, and other associated structures. And it is generally, we don't make identifications based on roots, but you can make an identification based on just about any part of a plant. If somebody who's really familiar with plants looks at a twig, they can tell what tree that twig came from, even if there's no leaves on it. They can look at the bark of a tree and tell what kind of tree it belongs to. If you look at my Instagram over the winter, I posted multiple videos where I was showing the different barks of different trees and how to recognize leafless, flowerless trees by how their bark looked. And for some of them, it's very easy. There are some where it's much more challenging, but for a lot of them, they're quite distinctive, and you can actually recognize them without a whole lot of practice. So check that out on my Instagram if you want to see more about that. Hang on just a second. Yeah, okay. And let's see. So, and then with the flowers, flowers are often a very recognizable part of the plant. And it's good to be aware that they're composed of multiple concentric circles, multiple whorls of the sepals, the petals, the male parts of the plant and the female parts of the plant. And of course, that those might not all be present on any given plant. There are flowers out there that don't have male parts. There are flowers out there that don't have female parts. There are flowers out there that don't have petals. So, you know, there are various different setups, lots and lots of variations on the same general theme. But the general theme and the kinship between all the plants is generally pretty visible, especially when you're talking about flowering plants as opposed to non-flowering plants. Grasses tend to be a lot harder to recognize for most people, which is probably part of why there are not that many grasses used in herbal medicine. And most of the ones that are used in herbal medicine have some distinct scent to them, like sweetgrass or lemongrass. But you can, generally speaking, also differentiate grasses based on what their flower and seed inflorescences look like, and the shape and size of their stems and leaves and so forth. But they are, you know, not nearly as visually distinctive as flowering plants. So that's a general overview of plant anatomy and we looked at the different layers of the leaves and roots and stems. And, you know, all of this might seem kind of academic and boring at the moment, but I promise that as you go along, having a little bit of a foundation in plant anatomy is going to make it a lot easier for you to learn to recognize plants and tell them apart from each other. So, let's see. So, in addition to that, I wanted to talk about a couple of specific herbs this week. Namely sesame oil and nettles, stinging nettles. So sesame oil is an interesting one because it doesn't really sound like an herb to a lot of people. But it is a wonderful and powerful plant medicine with a very deep history of medicinal use. It's not really a part of my lived environment. I've tried growing sesame plants once, and that was an interesting thing to do, but it doesn't tend to grow around here on its own. It's not an ideal habitat for it or anything. But in the traditional medicine of India, where it does grow and is grown, it is a cultivated plant for the most part. It has a lot of uses. So this is a plant, it's an oil seed plant. So seeds are harvested from the plant. And of course you can eat the seeds, you can add them to bread, that sort of thing. They contain some protein and they contain some oil. But the oil itself, when squished out of the seeds and separated from the seed paste and purified, has a long history of use for a wide variety of healing purposes. I really first started learning about sesame oil as a medicinal plant. Well, when I was in Central Asia, people were using it quite a bit, really. And so I learned about it a little bit from there. And then I started reading some traditional classical texts of the traditional medicine from India, Ayurveda, specifically a book called the Sushruta Samhita, which is the collection of a physician named Sushruta, and the Charak Samhita, which is by somebody called Charak. And both of them used sesame oil a lot. especially the first one. He was like a very much a part of just about any healing process. And so that's kind of what turned me on to the fact that this was something special and different. And it has, in general, it's very similar to other oils in a lot of ways, but it also has some properties that make it different, that make it unique. We're talking about sesame oil for you who just joined. So sesame oil, like other oils, is emollient. It's helps to retain moisture in the skin. It helps to form a protective barrier over certain types of wounds. Perhaps less like other oils, it has a lot of stuff in it that helps to preserve it. Hang on just a second. I'm not sure what to do about this. It has some vitamin E. It has a lot of vitamin E. It has a lot of antioxidant substances in it that are there in the seed to help protect the seed, to keep the seed from molding, to keep the seed from being overcome by fungus or bacteria as it's starting to grow. But when they have been pressed out into the oil, they will do the same thing in keeping fungus and bacteria from growing on your body and in your wounds and things like that. So one of the main things that I use sesame oil for is as an antifungal for the skin and for the surfaces of the body. It can be used for candida infections as well, but it's really great for things like athlete's foot or ringworm that are just minor fungal infections on the skin. They tend to be superficial, kind of annoying. They thrive on dampness and heat. So it helps to wash them, but it doesn't help to keep them damp for a while, for a lot of the day. If you're sweating a lot, things like that, it can make them worse. That's why it's, athlete's foot rather than, say, office worker's foot or something like that. But anybody can get it, but it tends to happen when your feet are wet and warm for a long period of time. So sesame oil will actually kill the fungus that causes that. And it soothes, because often that fungus causes the skin to be dried and cracked and thickened, and it helps with that. It helps symptomatically with that, and it helps to kill off the fungus. So I've used it a whole lot for that, and I keep it around. I keep it in the clinic and just have people use it for, fungal infections on the skin are really common in children, partly because they don't have the best hygiene and they play in the dirt and things like that, and partly because they have thin, sensitive skin. So the presence of fungus is pretty much a given for all humans. Everybody has fungus on their skin all the time. And when the conditions are right, that fungus takes off and starts doing things. So, pretty much everybody alive in the world right now has candida. Pretty much everybody alive in the world right now has the fungus that causes athlete's foot or ringworm or whatever on their skin in insignificant quantities. But it becomes clinically significant when there's a prolonged period of dampness and heat, and also some other factors. Sometimes fungal infections show up a lot more in people who are malnourished or people who have a suppressed immune system, whether it's from chemotherapy or biologics that they're taking for autoimmune diseases, or whether it's from an immunodeficiency situation like an HIV, something like that, where it will the immune system wouldn't be able to fight off things that it would normally be able to get rid of. So sometimes you see things like that, but a lot of the time it's just an opportunistic thing in terms of having the right type of environment to live in. So it's when it is there, trying to change that environment is paramount. Trying to make sure that somebody's feet stay dry, somebody's skin stays clean, that sort of thing. But in addition to that, the sesame oil really helps to kill off the fungus, the overgrowth of the fungus, and get things back to normal. So it's really useful for that. And is very well tolerated. I don't think I've ever seen anybody have a bad reaction to the topical application of sesame oil. It's just tends to be, pretty well tolerated. And so that's something that that you can keep sesame oil around for and use it for. Additionally, when it's taken internally, it has very high amounts of calories. If you give somebody a spoonful of sesame oil, that's a couple hundred calories, a large spoonful of sesame oil. If you give somebody 3 large spoonfuls of sesame oil at the same time, it's going to have a laxative effect. It's going to be too much for them to absorb at the same time. There might be situations where you would want to do that, but don't do it accidentally. But if you give them that same spoonful 3 times during a day, 4 to 6 hours each apart, then it won't have that effect because they'll get a chance to digest it. So if you have somebody who needs calories, who needs to get nutrition into their system, but has no appetite, something really calorically dense like sesame oil can be really helpful. So it's nourishing, it's nurturing. It provides a lot of fat, decent quality fat, as well as calories. When it's taken as food, it can be added to food as well. But a lot of the time, like I said, I would be using this in a situation where someone is just really deficient in calories and deficient in energy. And it's a way of pushing a large amount of calories into them all at once. That might, not be so, won't feel heavy in their stomach because it doesn't weigh much of anything. So that's another use of sesame oil that it has been put to traditionally. It's also really nurturing to the skin when it's applied topically, and to the hair as well, and to the hair follicles. So sometimes using it on areas that have lost hair, not always, not consistently, but sometimes applying sesame oil to an area where the hair has fallen out, like in alopecia. If you do that for a couple months, sometimes it will the hair follicles will become active again. Similarly, I've had people who lost hair like from their eyelashes or from their eyebrows and things like that during the course of sicknesses, and it sometimes helps with that. Massaging it into the scalp is something that I've been doing. I've been having some people do. A lot of people lost hair or had hair thin after having COVID. And so it's been helpful in that situation for quite a few people, or it seems to be helpful. It may just be the passage of time, and it can be difficult to sort which is actually going on. But in the people that I've had to try that, it seems like it's helping. And it doesn't cost much, and it doesn't have much of a potential for harm. So I think it's well worth a try. Abraded skin or cuts, anything like that, not when they're fresh, but as they're healing, putting sesame oil on them can help to heal them up. Doing it when they're fresh is a little bit more of a dicey thing. You have to be really careful about not sealing in infection. But it can be a useful thing for that too. Sushruta used it a lot in post-surgical incisions and things like that. And part of it, what might be going on there, is that it's inhibiting the growth of bacteria and funguses, but also holding in moisture and keeping an environment in which healing and cell replication can happen more easily. So if somebody has a large abrasion, it can be really helpful for that, helping it to just kind of dry up and scab over and clear off more easily and with less scarring. It does tend to reduce the possibility of scarring. In people who have scars, putting sesame oil on them, rubbing sesame oil into them on a daily basis, especially warm sesame oil, sometimes makes the scars fade and soften. It doesn't necessarily make them disappear entirely, but it does make them less pronounced and sometimes, less visible. So those are all traditional uses that have been documented for sesame oil for thousands of years. So it is an herb where we have literally thousands of years of written history of use about how people have been using it. It doesn't grow around here, in contrast to the vast majority of things that I use in my practice, but it is readily available. You can buy it at the grocery store. You can buy it with EBT if that's what you have. It's considered food, so it's pretty readily available, and rather fairly inexpensive for the amount of it that you get. And it lasts a while. I mean, usually when you're using it topically, you're using a few drops of it at a time. When you're using it internally, you're using a few spoonfuls of it a day. So it's not necessarily something that you would be needing or using very huge quantities of. I'll be right back. So, yeah, it can be found pretty readily. Like I said, a lot of what its properties are about it being an oil, and it shares some of these properties with other oils like olive oil or coconut oil. But it's antifungal properties, and it's the degree to which it speeds up the healing of injuries seems to me to be more than just that. So in addition to using sesame oil by itself, I also use it as the base for a lot of the salves that I make. So we'll learn more about salve making later on, but they often have an oil and some kind of a thickening agent like a wax in them. And I often use sesame oil as the oil. I also use it as the extracting medium for a lot of the oil extracts that I have. So, for example, I might take an herb and make an extract of it into sesame oil if I want an herbal oil for some reason. And we'll get it more into that when we're talking about production here in a little bit, in a few lessons. But sesame oil is a really good basis for things like that. So for instance, I have a couple different salves here that I've made. This one is based in olive oil, and you can see it's got this kind of bright green color to it. And this one is made in sesame oil, which has more of a brownish color to it. So this is a calendula salve made with beeswax and sesame oil. And then this one is made out of black seed and olive oil. And so every different oil has its own set of different properties when you're talking about salve making and other herbal product making. But sesame oil is a nice one because it is very it's very well tolerated. It doesn't cause pimples if people use it on their face. It's not it doesn't really have, it does have a little bit of a smell, but it doesn't have a very strong smell to it. It's sort of fixative. If you're using it with aromatic things, it helps the aromatic stuff not evaporate away as fast as it would from some other oils. So that's a good property that it has as well. So yeah, sesame oil is not something that I make myself or grow myself or find out in the woods, but it is pretty useful and has a very deep, very strong tradition of use behind it. And so it's something that I recommend people be familiar with based on that. It's one of my top herbs as far as being versatile, powerful, and well tolerated. Another herb that I want to talk to you about today is stinging nettle. Stinging nettle is a pretty interesting type of thing. It is, there are a couple different species, but Urtica is the genus. Urtica dioica is the main species that that I use and that people around here tend to use. It has, like sesame oil, it has some different sets of properties depending on how it's being used. So the one thing that people really notice about stinging nettles, it's a very nondescript plant. The flowers are not showy at all. The leaves are very simple and leaf shaped. But if you touch it, it stings you. And that is kind of surprising to people who aren't familiar with it. I first encountered it when I was a little kid. I swam across a river, and when I came out on the other side of the river, I started feeling something stinging me. And at first I assumed it was like these little bugs called no-see-ums that are, you know, small biting insects that you can't necessarily see. So I thought that it was that at first, and I was just sort of swatting at them in the assumption that they were there, but it wasn't really helping. And then I noticed that it was actually the plants that were doing it, plants growing along the riverbank that I had swam to. And so then I, you know, jumped back in the water and swam back to the other side. But it was, you know, I was aware that stinging nettles existed. I had heard of them before, but I didn't know what they looked like. After that, I knew what they looked like. Even though they're very plain looking, I learned to recognize them. So the sting of stinging nettle is actually something that has a history of medicinal uses. When I was talking about cayenne before, I talked about the concept of a counter irritant, of something causing a superficial pain that relieves a deeper pain. So that's basically something that the sting of stinging nettles has been used for. And this is a process or a treatment called urtication, where someone would sting someone with a nettle, or someone can do it to themselves, but stinging over an area that hurts to get the pain to go away. And with some people, I've talked to a lot of people really who have had rheumatoid arthritis that flares up and goes away periodically, and who have, after urtication, have had it go into remission and stay in remission for, in one case, over 20 years. So, you know, sometimes it will go away. It will really change the inflammatory processes that are going on in the body in a way that we don't necessarily understand real well. So for somebody who isn't used to stinging nettles, sometimes they feel really painful. For most people, they're merely annoying. If you're unfamiliar with them, I suggest, you know, touching your wrist to one and seeing what it feels like. You know, it's usually not excruciating or anything like that. And the potential for actual harm from our common stinging nettles is not very much. People don't tend to have anaphylactic reactions to them or anything like that, the way that they might to bee stings, for instance. They're just kind of somewhat painful. Sometimes they can cause, a sort of a raised welt or something like that. That can be a little more intense, but for the most part, it's just like a sensation, a burning sensation, stinging sensation. So that part has been used medicinally, but it goes away when it's dried or when it's cooked. So if you take stinging nettles and you dry them, they don't sting anymore. If you take them and you boil them, that gets rid of the sting too. People have cooked them and eaten them as greens for forever, always, I suppose. If you take one and eat it raw, that's not necessarily something you want to do. It will sting the inside of your mouth. It doesn't do anything terrible to you, but it does hurt. I tried it just to see what it would be like, so I could tell you about it. But it's not necessarily a good idea. But if you cook it, I've often cooked them and mashed them in with mashed potatoes, for instance. But you can just cook them just like spinach or any other green, and they're pretty edible, pretty good tasting, just very vegetable-y. You can also make a tea out of them. And nettle tea or nettle tincture made out of dried nettle leaves or fresh nettle leaves has a wide variety of medicinal uses. So it is very much fits into the category I just mentioned of being well tolerated, powerful, and versatile. So I want to talk about some of the different things that it does. And one of the things that it does is that it's nutritive. It contains lots of minerals. It contains some molecular, some small proteins, and it has a history of use for building the blood. In other words, if someone's anemic, it's got lots of iron in it. If someone doesn't have enough red cells, it has a lot of what the body needs to make those red cells. And it also seems to strengthen the blood vessels as well. So if someone's having like a situation where they're bruising easily or something like that, it can be pretty useful for those people. And that's just because of its nurturing qualities. And it's because it's liquid, it's something that people can easily take who don't have a lot of capacity for food, who are maybe not feeling well enough to eat solid foods, things like that. And it really provides some deep nourishment, and lots of planty stuff, lots of phytochemicals, lots of antioxidants, minerals, things like that. So it's a really good plant. It's sort of like, in a way, it's almost like it's the most generic herb. Like if you had just a plain flavored herb, that's kind of what stinging nettle is like. It's not spicy, it's not minty, it's not bitter, it's not sour. It's just kind of right in the middle of all of that. It's just like plain old herb. But it's really nourishing and really good for the blood vessels and the tissue of the blood itself. And so I use it a lot in both of those situations, and especially for people who are kind of malnourished, especially older people, people who have been struggling with addiction, people who maybe have not had a secure source of food, things like that for a long period of time. People tend to get depleted, even if they're getting a decent amount of calories, they can tend to get pretty depleted just because some things here and there are missing from the profile of what nutrients they're getting versus what nutrients they need. And nettle can really help to redress that balance for a lot of people. And so that's one of the main things that I would use it for, and especially in that situation, nettle infusion is really good, which is just like a strong tea made from nettles. You can boil some water, pour it over some dried nettle leaves, and let it steep overnight. And then when you pour it off, it will be so dark green that it's almost black, and it will just have lots of really good plant substances in it for helping someone's body. And it tastes very planty. Now, in addition to those uses, I also use it for a couple other things. This is nettle. This is some nettle tincture. The tincture is mostly gone, so I'll show you what I mean by the leaves. I use nettle to nurture and strengthen the kidneys, both in terms of strengthening the immediate response of the kidneys, making someone pee more, and also strengthening kidney function and how much the kidneys are filtering the blood and things like that. So if someone is having their kidneys checked and they're not doing very well, sometimes nettle is helpful for that. So here's what a nettle leaf looks like. It's just kind of like a leaf-shaped leaf. Like if you said to imagine a leaf shape, it's kind of like that, but with a toothed margin. There's a slightly bigger one. Nettle leaf. And so it has these tiny hairs on it. I don't know that those will be able to be visible under the camera. It has these tiny hairs on it, on the underside of the leaf especially, that are the stinging cells. And those are full of plant venom. They are full of little bits of a few different chemicals that get injected through those hairs into your skin. They don't go into your bloodstream, just into the surface of your skin, but they provoke a strong reaction of stinging and burning. So yeah, I use nettle to nurture the kidneys. If somebody takes some nettle extract, it will make them pee more. If they're doing it over a longer period of time, it will tend to make their kidneys stronger and more self-sufficient and more able to remove waste products from the body, and often kind of take away the need for continuing to use medicine for them. So they can be, in some cases, really helpful to getting people to be healthier, have healthier, stronger kidneys, and also to, if someone needs a diuretic for a short period of time, so something that is going to make their kidneys work more strongly for a short period of time, nettles are great for that too. And some instances of why you might want to do that would be if somebody has high blood pressure, sometimes you can bring it down by getting the kidneys to remove more fluid from the body. If someone were having pain that might be a stone or something like that, sometimes nettle will help to break those up and expel them. So it can be useful for those types of situations. Nettle also contains some stuff that's nurturing to the nervous system. The potassium that's in it, for instance, it contains a lot of potassium, which is useful to the kidneys and the muscles, and is used throughout the body and throughout the nervous system. But it's a really good thing to have replenished, and that nettle is good at replenishing. So I often use it in blends with other things for the nervous system. Plain nettle by itself isn't like psychoactive or anything, but it provides nutrients that the nervous system needs, and for that reason I'm often including it in blends for the nervous system, along with other herbs that are more nervous system specific. So those are all some really good uses for nettles. Another thing that I use it for is for allergies. And this is something where some people say that you have to use fresh or freeze-dried nettles. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that they do help, that they may be better quality, but that you don't absolutely have to use them in that form. then if dried nettles are what you have, then dried nettles can be helpful for this too. But they contain some antihistamines that don't cause drowsiness or any kind of stimulation or sedation or anything like that, and are often helpful for allergies. And I find them to be especially helpful for outdoor type allergies like pollen allergies, which people get, tree pollen allergies early in the spring, and then towards August and September, you tend to get a lot of ragweed pollen and other pollen from herbaceous plants. So there are two different peak seasons for each of those types of pollen, but we're kind of a little bit in between them right now. But sometimes people would describe it as hay fever. Sometimes people would just say seasonal allergies or whatever. But nettle is something that I very often use in that situation, often just as a simple, just nettle extract by itself, a tincture of nettle. And this batch here is made from fresh nettles. There are, you can also get dried nettles. Dried nettles are something you could buy from just about any herb company. Fresh nettles are abundant in the woods in Kentucky at certain times of the year, so I often will go out and get them. And because it's a largish plant and because it's prolific in the areas where it grows, if you decided that you wanted to go out and get 50 pounds of nettles, you could do so pretty easily. I have gone and gotten very large amounts of it on a few different occasions, and you can gather it from the same spot multiple times in the course of a year. You don't have to uproot it or anything. You can just come along and snip it off with scissors about a foot or so off of the ground, and take the tops of it. And you probably want to have some personal protective equipment when you're doing this, gloves in a basket at a minimum, so that you don't actually have to be handling the stinging parts of the plant with your bare hands. But I do, and I don't really mind the way that it feels so much. It doesn't sting me very badly, but I have kind of thicker skin on my hands than some people too. So anyway, if you want to gather large amounts of it, you can gather large amounts of it fairly easily and without a lot of undue environmental impact. It loves to grow along rivers and streams. It's what we call a riparian species. It's not exclusively riparian, but riparian meaning that it grows along the banks of waterways. So you'll often find it in those types of places. And like I said, you'll often find very large amounts of it, hillsides or riverbanks or whatever covered in it. And sometimes it will be, multiple feet tall. And so you can get a lot of it. These stems of nettle can actually be dried and beaten up into thin fibers, and those fibers can be spun into string. So it can be used to make textiles out of, and has been used for that in the past. Probably is still used for that to some small extent now. And I've made a small amount of cordage from them, just to see what it was like. It makes very strong threads. The root of nettle is actually used medicinally as well. It can be cooked in oil and made into an oil extract, and nettle root oil is sort of used as a tonic for the male reproductive system. Tends to keep testosterone in the body from getting broken down into a less active form, and so thereby increasing the overall testosterone activity that's going on in the body. So it's something that has been and is used for that purpose as well. So works on the circulatory system, does great stuff for the urinary system, works on the endocrine system a little bit, nervous system some, and is generally nutritive. So it's a plant with a very wide variety of different uses, and tends to be very well tolerated, and very helpful. And of course, the immune system effect and pain relieving effect of the sting itself. So, it's really covering a lot of different bases. So, if you needed to just have sesame oil as a topical and nettle as an internal remedy, you could still treat a wide range of different ailments if those were your only two remedies that you used. Same with cayenne and garlic from last week. If all you had was cayenne and garlic, you could treat a huge, wide variety of different situations. But instead of that, you can have nettle and sesame and cayenne and garlic and dandelion and white pine. And you can treat all sorts of different things with just those handful of herbs. And next week, we'll talk about 2 more, and then you'll have 10 that you can work with. And with those 10 herbs, you would be able to deal with a good 80% of what's out there, if that's all the further you went with it. But I encourage you to stick with it and learn more and more, and also learn more about how to work with those herbs, which we will do. Especially, we will talk some more in the coming weeks about how to make medicines, how to make remedies from herbs. And then there's also the matter of how to know which remedies to use for which situations. So the question was, how do you say to use it for arthritis? So I was talking about using the sting of fresh nettle over the joints that are irritated and inflamed or painful, to try and dispel arthritis. It's one of those dramatic, intense remedies that I don't necessarily love, but it's an interesting one because it's actually using a sting to provoke an immune response, which in the case of some arthritis might just be creating inflammation and pain that draws away from the more deep inflammation and pain. But in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, it's actually changing what type of an inflammatory response your body is having at that place in your body. And that can sometimes seemingly switch off rheumatoid arthritis flares and get them to sometimes stay in remission for long periods of time. And sometimes it just stings, but it usually seems to help. It really does usually seem to help. Just a moment, I'll be right back. Okay. So, any questions about sesame or nettle? All right. So this weekend, Saturday at 11, I'm going to be doing the herb walk, the first of this course, at Heisel Farm Park, which is on the north side of Lexington, sort of out Bryan Station Road. And I will let me write that down in the chat. All right, so that is going to be probably around 2 hours. And what will happen is we will convene in the area next to the barn, which is right by the parking lot. And then we will walk around, look at different plants that are growing in the area, and talk about what they are and what people use them for and how to recognize them. This is an area that used to be a farm and is being allowed to slowly turn back into an overgrown field and eventually a forest. But within this little area, it's not that little, but within this one area that is walkable in the space of part of a morning, it has, there's going to be meadow type. That's the kind of predominant landscape there is meadow, but there will also be some forest, some wetland, pond type habitat, and some area that's transitioning from meadow to forest. And in addition to that, there will be some area that's kind of more maintained as a human influenced area. And we'll see some of the different types of things that were growing there, different types of things that were planted there by people and are still growing many, many years later, as well as things that are sort of hitchhiking on the human habitation there, that are along for that ride. There are some invasive plants that are taking over parts of the area, and there are some native plants that are dominating parts of the area. So we'll get to see these different types of plant communities, get to see how the land is changing over the course of years of being no longer used as a farm, and get to see some of how the wildlife interacts with the plant community there as well, but also, a lot of the edible and medicinal plants that are growing there. So there will be a very large number of different plant species there. I recommend that anybody is coming, bring your camera, bring a notebook. If you want to bring friends, if you want to bring kids, anything like that, that's fine. And wear comfortable shoes, because we will be walking around a fair bit. It's not a very strenuous terrain or anything. It's just kind of fields, rolling hills, nothing steep or really intense like we might see in some other areas we might visit later. So just kind of, moderate exercise, and we won't be like marching or anything. We'll do like a little bit of a walk and then stop and look at a plant and talk about that plant for several minutes. And then we'll walk a little bit further and come to another plant and talk about it. Often what we'll do is we'll walk to one area and talk about several different plants that are in that area, and then go from there and until we get into a different micro habitat with a different set of plants and talk about multiple plants in that area. So we'll probably see dozens of different plants out there. And like I said, if you want to get your hands on some plants and get started learning about like what they feel like, what they smell like, stuff like that, this is a really good opportunity for that. And good chance to kind of see in this general area. If you are in this general area, it's a good chance to see kind of plant communities, because in here I'm talking about individual herbs and what they do, but out in the real world it tends to be like groups of plants growing together and groups of plants influencing one another. So that's the sort of thing that we'll see when we're out there. And like I said, might be dozens of different plants, including some trees, including some bushes, including some flowering herbaceous plants. There aren't really a lot of ferns out there or anything like that, but there are many varieties of different trees, shrubs, and herbs growing there. And additionally, it's a great place to see birds and various other small creatures. So I hope that everybody who can will make it out to it. I think it's a really good learning opportunity. Like I said, it will be live streamed and saved to watch later. At least that's the plan. There's always the possibility of some technical difficulty, but that's the plan. And so there is that possibility if making it in person isn't an option for you. But if making it in person is an option for you, it's a really good thing to do. And I hope that as many people as possible will come. And yes, it's definitely okay to bring a guest with you. I've had people bring partners and children and friends and stuff like that. I'll be doing and saying the same things regardless of who is there. So, bring whoever you want, as long as they're not disruptive, at least minimally disruptive. With kids, we make an allowance. They can be a bit disruptive because, that's their way, but at least not combative or anything like that. So yeah, I think that it'll be a really nice time to be out there. Hopefully the weather cooperates. You never know about that, but it's a good time of year to be out there. Not generally blazing hot yet, and lots of variety of different plants that are up and doing things, active, and at various different phases in their life cycle. So for instance, there will be raspberry plants, and the raspberries will have unripe fruit on them. And there will be mulberry trees, and the mulberries may have a few ripe fruits on them, and so on. So we'll see lots of different stuff, and it'll be a good chance to do that sort of thing. And also, if people come, a good chance for you to meet one another. And good networking opportunity. I've also invited the students from last year's class to come, and so some of them might be there as well. All right. So that again is this coming Saturday at 11 a.m. And all right, any questions about that or about anything that we've talked about today? All right. We'll see those of you who make it on Saturday, and I will talk to you all again next week as well. So thanks for coming.